leveraged publicly. The moment Princess Anne broke her silence, the illusion shattered. Not cracked, shattered. Because behind the polished smiles, the curated Netflix tears, and the carefully staged California sunsets, there was something far colder hiding in plain sight. Something buried deep inside legal paper, invisible to the public but lethal to Prince Harry's entire existence. And when Anne revealed it, the truth didn't whisper, it detonated. The man who walked away from the crown to find freedom may have unknowingly signed away the one thing he could never replace. Himself. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere wasn't tense. It was surgical, calculated, controlled, because this wasn't gossip anymore. This was evidence. And Princess Anne, quiet, observant, and famously impossible to manipulate, had spent months assembling it piece by piece. While the world laughed at royal memes and argued over podcast ratings, Anne and a tiny circle of trusted insiders were digging through contracts, amendments, and corporate filings. What they found made even the most hardened palace veterans go pale. Page 14. Clause 7 data didn't look dangerous at first glance. That was the genius of it. Just another block of legal language buried in the mountain of paperwork Harry signed during the chaos of his post-royal escape. But when Anne read it closely, the words stopped being legal and started becoming terrifying. Clause 7 didn't protect Harry. Clause 7 owned him. It granted Meghan Markle complete intellectual property control over Harry's personal narrative. Not partially, not temporarily, completely. His memories, his trauma, his childhood, his pain, his confessions, his healing. Every interview, every memoir, every documentary, every future attempt to explain himself to the world. All of it required one thing, her permission. Without it, he couldn't speak. Without it, he couldn't defend himself. Without it, he didn't exist publicly anymore. Anne reportedly sat in silence after realizing the implications. Because this wasn't marriage paperwork. This was narrative capture. Emotional ownership disguised as partnership. And according to palace records referenced in the internal briefing Princess Anne leaked Meghan MAR, Harry had signed it during one of the most emotionally unstable periods of his life, isolated from his family, drowning in public scrutiny, and desperate for stability. He never saw the cage closing. He signed it himself. When Anne presented the findings privately, witnesses say the room fell into a suffocating silence. King Charles didn't interrupt. Prince William didn't argue, because there was nothing to argue with. The words were clear. Meghan didn't just marry Harry. She legally positioned herself as the gatekeeper of his voice. And suddenly, everything made sense. Why his interviews always followed the same emotional script. Why his memoir sounded polished, but strangely distant from his own raw pain. Why every public confession seemed perfectly timed, perfectly controlled, perfectly aligned with a larger media narrative. Because behind the scenes, approval wasn't emotional. It was contractual. And then came the second bombshell. While Harry believed they were building a shared empire, Meghan had quietly separated her financial identity entirely. Corporate filings revealed that her brand assets, media ventures, and licensing structures were registered solely under her control. Her companies didn't include his name. Her trademarks didn't include his authority. Her deals didn't include his protection. He wasn't an owner. He was an asset. A living, breathing asset whose royal bloodline powered an empire he didn't legally control. Princess Anne reportedly described it in words that stunned everyone present. She didn't call it manipulation. She didn't call it betrayal. She called it architecture. An architecture of dependency so precise, so legally reinforced, that escaping it would cost Harry everything. His income streams, his publishing rights, his media future, even his ability to publicly contradict any narrative already established under Meghan's control. And that's when the palace realized this wasn't just a marital risk, this was an institutional threat. Because Harry wasn't just a husband, he was a prince. And if his narrative could be commercially controlled by a private individual, then royal history itself could be rewritten without the crown's consent. Meanwhile, Harry remained unaware of the full scope of the danger. At least at first. Insiders say he believed the contracts were mutual protections, safeguards against media exploitation, insurance against tabloid distortion. He thought he was protecting their future. He didn't realize he was surrendering his autonomy. By early 2026, Meghan's corporate structure had evolved into something far more independent than anyone publicly understood. Her lifestyle brand, her podcast deals, her production rights, her licensing agreements. all meticulously structured to remain exclusively hers. Even in the event of separation, Harry's presence fueled the brand, but he didn't own the brand. And the most devastating realization came when Palace legal advisors explained the ultimate consequence that if Harry tried to leave and speak freely, he could be legally blocked from telling his own story. Block, silence, erase, imagine the horror of discovering your memories don't legally belong to you anymore. Imagine realizing your past has an owner. Witnesses say Harry was visibly shaken when he finally understood. Because this wasn't about money. This wasn't about reputation. This was about identity, the core of who he was, his truth, his voice, his pain, his healing. All of it locked behind a contractual gate controlled by someone else. And Princess Anne knew exactly what it meant, because Anne had watched Meghan's strategic precision for years. The careful distancing, the gradual separation of financial power, the slow consolidation of narrative authority, the quiet transformation from partner into controller. None of it happened overnight. It happened step by step, paper by paper, signature by signature, and Harry never saw it coming. By the time the palace finished reviewing the full structure, one conclusion became unavoidable. If Harry walked away now, he wouldn't just lose his marriage, he could lose his voice, he could lose his financial independence, he could lose his ability to defend himself publicly, he could lose everything. And the most haunting part wasn't the legal trap, it was the emotional one, because according to those closest to him, Harry didn't sign Clause 7 out of fear. He signed it out of trust, that love meant protection, trust that. This wasn't just family drama. This was narrative warfare. And if the monarchy didn't act, its history could be commercially reshaped without its consent. So she did what she had always done in moments of crisis. She exposed the truth, not loudly, not emotionally, but decisively. Because in the end, the most dangerous prison isn't built with walls, it's built with signatures. And Harry had already signed his. And then came the moment Prince Harry realized the truth wasn't just something happening around him, it was happening to him. Because while the public still believed the Sussex Empire was thriving behind the glossy California gates, inside those walls, something had already begun collapsing, and Harry could feel it. Not in headlines, not in rumors, but in silence. A suffocating silence that wrapped itself around his future like invisible chains. Calls that used to include him suddenly didn't. Legal discussions happened without his presence. Decisions about projects built on his life were finalized without his signature. And slowly, terrifyingly, Harry began to understand something no prince in modern history had ever faced before. He was no longer the author of his own story. Princess Anne had seen this coming long before Harry did. She had watched the gradual shift, not dramatic enough to cause panic, but precise enough to ensure control. Financial filings that removed his authority quietly. Licensing agreements that listed Meghan as sole executive decision-maker. Corporate restructuring that ensured if anything fell apart, she walked away intact while Harry stood exposed. It wasn't emotional, it was structural. And structures like that didn't collapse by accident. They were designed to withstand war, but the true nightmare wasn't the contracts. It was what those contracts enabled, because hidden deep inside the legal framework was the power to shape Harry's identity itself. Not just financially, not just professionally, but publicly. Clause 7 didn't just restrict him, it defined him. Every future interview, every confession, every attempt to reclaim his truth would have to pass through a legal filter controlled entirely outside his authority. He could exist, but only within boundaries already drawn for him. But imagine the horror of realizing your freedom wasn't taken from you by force, but by permission you gave willingly. That realization hit Harry hardest when he reportedly requested access to his own contractual history. He wanted clarity, he wanted reassurance, he wanted to believe there was a way out. But what he found instead wasn't reassurance. It was confirmation. His publishing rights, restricted. His independent media appearances, subject to approval, his ability to profit from his own experiences, legally entangled. Even his future memoirs, his voice, his therapy, his healing could be blocked entirely if they didn't align with the narrative already authorized. Bar for the first time in his life, Prince Harry wasn't fighting the monarchy, he was fighting invisibility. Inside palace walls, Princess Anne wasted no time escalating the situation. She understood that if Harry's narrative could be privately controlled, it wasn't just his identity at risk. It was the monarchy's institutional integrity itself. Royal lineage wasn't supposed to be a commodity. It wasn't supposed to be licensed, edited, or filtered through commercial authority. It was history, legacy, continuity. And now that continuity was under threat. Legal advisors began preparing countermeasures immediately. Because while Harry had signed Clause 7 as a private individual, his identity wasn't entirely private. He was still a born royal. His life wasn't just his own, it was part of an institution older than any modern contract. And if necessary, the crown could assert sovereign authority to challenge any agreement that threatened its historical continuity. Behind closed doors, discussions intensified. King Charles remained measured, but deeply concerned. Prince William was reportedly furious, not just at Meghan, but at the system that allowed Harry to become vulnerable in the first place. And Anne remained exactly what she had always been: relentless, calm, precise, focused entirely on reclaiming what Harry had unknowingly surrendered. Meanwhile, Meghan's silence grew louder. No emotional rebuttals, no public defense, no direct confrontation, just calculated quiet, the kind of quiet that suggested preparation, not panic. Because silence, in situations like this, wasn't weakness. It was leveraged. Publicly, everything still appeared intact. Carefully staged appearances, controlled messaging, selective visibility. But insiders began noticing subtle changes. Harry appearing alone more frequently, Meghan's business activities accelerating independently, separate legal consultations, separate brand expansions, separate futures quietly forming beneath the illusion of unity. And then came the moment that shook Harry to his core. He reportedly asked a question that no prince should ever have to ask: do I still own my own voice? The answer wasn't immediate. Because the truth wasn't simple. Legally, his voice existed. Contractually, it was restricted. Commercially, it was controlled. Emotionally, it was fractured. For Harry, the realization wasn't explosive, it was suffocating. A slow creeping awareness that the freedom he thought he had gained may have simply transformed into a different kind of captivity. One without palaces, without protocols, without crowns, but with contracts far more permanent than royal tradition ever was. Princess Anne understood that time wasn't on Harry's side. Every day that passed strengthened the legal structure surrounding him. Every new deal signed, every new intellectual property filing, every new licensing agreement reinforced the reality that Meghan's control wasn't temporary, it was expanding. And Anne knew exactly what that meant, that if Harry didn't act soon, reclaiming his narrative might become impossible. Because narrative control wasn't just about money, it was about perception, and perception shaped reality. Whoever controlled Harry's story controlled how the world saw him, controlled his legacy, controlled his redemption. Controlled everything. Inside Windsor, quiet preparations began unfolding. Legal teams reviewing sovereign override possibilities, institutional protections being considered, narrative sovereignty being reasserted, not publicly, not dramatically, but strategically, because the monarchy didn't operate on emotion. It operated on permanence. Harry, meanwhile, faced a choice no one could make for him: remain inside a structure where his voice required permission, or risk everything trying to break free from it. Neither option guaranteed safety, but neither option guaranteed victory. Because this wasn't just a divorce risk, it was an identity war. And identity wars didn't end with signatures, they ended with reclamation. Or surrender. Princess Anne had done her part. She exposed the truth, she revealed the architecture, she sounded the alarm. But the final move, the move that would determine whether Harry remained a narrative prisoner or became the author of his own future again, could only come from one person. Harry himself. Because in the end, the most devastating realization wasn't that Meghan held legal control over his story, it was that he had unknowingly given it to her. And reclaiming it wouldn't just cost him financially. It could cost him everything he had.